On a random night, a thoughtless phrase turned into a promise. The door swung open, bringing in everything he always ran from. A spontaneous move set off a journey no one could have guessed. What started as a joke became a life-changer for 5 people. Before you dive into this crazy story, hit subscribe for more wild tales about how chance can change everything. Classical music echoed softly through the dining room of Belle Epoque restaurant, mingling with the discreet clinking of crystal glasses and the elegant murmur of conversations in low tones. The golden lights created an atmosphere of sophistication that Richard Blackwell had known since childhood, but on that night caused him a strange feeling of suffocation. Seated at the main table, he observed the familiar faces around him. Successful businessmen, heirs of old New York families, impeccably dressed women who smiled at the exact moments and talked about subjects that sounded empty to his ears. At 32, Richard had everything society considered necessary for happiness: an inherited fortune multiplied through intelligent investments, a penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, imported cars, and access to the city's most exclusive circles. But that night, while listening for the 100th time to the same conversation about the real estate market and the next vacation destinations in Europe, a feeling of emptiness took hold of his chest with an intensity that frightened him. "Richard, are you okay?" Marianne Caldwell's soft voice brought him back to reality. She was sitting beside him, with her perfect posture and studied smile, representing everything his family hoped he would choose as a partner. Marianne was beautiful, intelligent, from a good family, and completely predictable. "I'm great," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking about some business matters." Across the table, his cousin Edward laughed loudly, clearly already affected by the French wine he kept serving. "Business? Richard, you need to relax more. Life can't be all work." Edward made an expansive gesture with his arm, almost knocking over his glass. "Look around us. We have everything a man could desire: money, status, beautiful women." "Maybe that's exactly the problem," murmured Richard, more to himself than to the others. "What do you mean?" asked Marianne, slightly furrowing her perfectly drawn eyebrows. Richard sighed and took a sip of his Scottish whiskey. "I don't know, Marianne. Sometimes I have the feeling that I'm living a life others planned for me. Every step I take, every decision I make, everything seems to be within an already written script." "What nonsense is this, cousin?" Edward leaned forward, his eyes shining with a mixture of alcohol and amusement. "You have a life that millions of people would dream of having. Stop the neuroses and enjoy it." "Edward's right," agreed Marianne, delicately placing her hand on Richard's arm. "You're going through a difficult phase since you completely took over the family business. It's normal to feel overwhelmed." Richard looked at her hand on his arm and felt a strange disconnection. It was as if he were observing the scene from outside, like an actor playing a role he hadn't chosen. "What if I did something completely unpredictable?" he asked suddenly. The momentary silence that followed was broken by Edward's laughter. "Unpredictable? You? The guy who plans even the color of the tie he'll wear next week?" "I'm serious," insisted Richard, feeling a strange energy growing inside him. "What if I made a decision that no one expected, something that completely escaped this theater we've become?" Marianne squeezed his arm more firmly. "Richard, you're scaring me." "What kind of decision?" He looked around the table, seeing the curious and slightly concerned faces of his friends. For a moment he considered backing down, apologizing, and pretending that moment of vulnerability hadn't happened. But then, as if an external force propelled him, he heard his own voice saying, "What if I married the first woman who walked through that door?" The silence that followed was even deeper. Edward stopped with his glass halfway to his mouth. Marianne withdrew her hand from his arm as if she'd received a shock, and the other guests looked at each other with expressions of surprise and embarrassment. "You're joking, right?" asked Marianne, forcing a laugh that sounded artificial. "It's a tasteless joke." "I'm not joking," replied Richard, surprising himself with the firmness in his own voice. "I'm tired of living a calculated life, where every movement is predicted. and approved by an invisible committee of social expectations. Edward put his glass down on the table with more force than he intended. "Richard, you've had too much to drink. This is madness." "Maybe that's exactly what I need," replied Richard, feeling more alive than he had felt in years. "A little madness, a little unpredictability." "And me?" asked Marianne, her voice betraying a mixture of hurt and indignation. "We've been together for 2 years, Richard. Our families have already started talking about marriage." Richard looked at her and for a moment felt a twinge of guilt. Marianne didn't deserve to be treated like this, and he knew it, but he also knew that continuing in that relationship would be an even greater injustice to both of them. "Marianne, you are a wonderful woman, but we both know that we're together because that's what's expected of us, not because we truly chose it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she maintained her composure. "So you're going to throw away everything we've built because of some adolescent fantasy?" "I'm not throwing anything away," said Richard, rising from his chair. "I'm trying to find something real." Edward also stood up, clearly agitated. "This is ridiculous. You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life," replied Richard, moving to a position where he could clearly see the restaurant entrance. "The first woman who walks through that door will be my wife." "What if it's a child?" someone at the table asked. "Or an 80-year-old lady," added another. "Then it will be a child or an 80-year-old lady," replied Richard, knowing he sounded completely crazy, but feeling more determined with each second. For the next few minutes, the group silently observed the restaurant entrance. Some people passed through the door, but they were all men, a couple of businessmen, a waiter returning from break, a delivery person. "See?" said Edward, relaxing slightly. "This proves it's an absurd idea. Hours could pass before a woman walks in there." But at the exact moment he finished speaking, the doorknob turned slowly. All eyes turned to the entrance, and Richard felt his heart accelerate in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The door opened, and through it entered a figure who caused an instant and silent impact on the entire environment. It was a woman. That was undeniable, but a woman completely out of place in that scene of elegance and sophistication. Her brown hair was disheveled and seemed not to have seen a comb in days. Her clothes, faded jeans torn at the knee, a t-shirt that had once been white but now showed stains of undefined origin, and a worn sweatshirt jacket, contrasted drastically with the elegant attire of the other patrons. She hesitated at the entrance, her eyes scanning the environment with a mixture of discomfort and determination. It was possible to see that she was nervous, but there was something in her posture that suggested a dignity that circumstances couldn't completely erase. The maitre d' of the restaurant approached her quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Excuse me, miss, but this is an establishment that requires a dress code." The woman interrupted him with a clear, though slightly hoarse voice. "I know what it's like here. I just need to find someone quickly." Richard felt as if time had stopped. There she was, the woman who, according to his own impulsive declaration, should become his wife. And she was everything but what anyone at that table would have imagined. Without thinking twice, he stood up and walked toward the entrance, ignoring the shocked whispers that began to spread from his table and the adjacent ones. "Excuse me," he said to the maitre d', who seemed even more confused to see one of the restaurant's most important clients approach. "She is my guest." The woman looked at him with surprise, her eyes. He noticed they were an intense green, studying his face, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of cruel joke. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I think there's a mistake. I don't know you." "Not yet," replied Richard, extending his hand. "My name is Richard Blackwell, and you just completely changed my life." The woman looked at Richard's outstretched hand with an expression that mixed distrust and curiosity. For a few seconds that seemed eternal. She didn't move, as if evaluating whether this was real or some kind of elaborate trap. "Changed your life?" she asked finally, without accepting the greeting. "You don't even know me." "That's exactly the point," replied Richard, keeping his hand extended. "Sometimes the biggest changes come from the unexpected." Around them, the buzz in the restaurant had almost completely ceased. The waiters stopped their activities, the other clients whispered among themselves, and from Richard's table came a tense silence that he could feel even without looking back. The woman took a quick look around, clearly aware that she had become the center of attention. "Look, I don't know what kind of joke this is, but I just need to find—" "Helen?" A female voice interrupted the conversation. An elegant woman, approximately 50 years old, approached them. It was Teresa Montgomery, owner of a chain of boutiques and a regular at Belle Epoque. "Helen, is that really you?" The woman, whose name Richard still didn't know, turned quickly, and for the first time since she entered, her face showed an expression of genuine recognition. "Mrs. Montgomery, you still come here?" "Of course I do, dear, but my God, what happened to you?" Helen, now Richard knew her name, lowered, her eyes clearly embarrassed. "It's a long story, Mrs. Montgomery. I only came here because I heard that you frequent this place, and I need help." Teresa looked around, noticing the curious glances, and then looked at Richard with an interrogative expression. "Excuse me, but do you know each other?" "We just met," replied Richard, still processing the dynamics of the situation. "I was inviting Helen to join our table." "Your table?" Helen stared at him with incredulity. "I haven't even agreed to talk to you properly, let alone sit at your table." Teresa observed the interaction with growing interest, her life experience, allowing her to perceive the undercurrents of the situation. "Helen, dear, why don't you tell me what's going on? And you, young man," she addressed Richard, "what exactly is your interest in the situation?" Richard felt the weight of all the impulsive decisions he had made in the last few minutes. How to explain to a stranger, and to Helen, that he had made an absurd bet that he now felt obliged to honor? How to talk about the existential emptiness that had led him to proclaim that he would marry the first woman who entered the restaurant? "It's complicated," he said finally, "but I can assure you that my intentions are sincere." "Sincere in relation to what?" asked Helen, crossing her arms. At that moment, Edward appeared beside Richard, clearly determined to interrupt what he considered a situation that had completely gotten out of control. "Richard, we need to talk, now." "Edward, this isn't the time," said Richard without taking his eyes off Helen. "It's exactly the time," insisted Edward, grabbing his cousin's arm. "You can't be serious about this madness." Helen looked from one man to the other, her distrust clearly increasing. "What madness? What are you talking about?" Teresa, who had remained observing the interaction with growing interest, decided to intervene. "Why don't we talk in a more private place? Helen, you look like you need to sit down, and these gentlemen obviously have something important to discuss." "Mrs. Montgomery, I don't want to be a bother," Helen began, but the older woman interrupted her. "Nonsense. You were never a bother, dear, and by the looks of it, you need help." She looked firmly at Richard. "Does your table have empty seats?" "Of course," replied Richard, ignoring the alarmed looks that Edward was giving him. "Please come with me." The walk back to the table was one of the longest in Richard's life. He could feel the gazes of everyone present, heard the whispers spreading through the restaurant like waves. Helen walked beside Teresa, clearly uncomfortable but maintaining her dignity, while Edward muttered imprecations under his breath. When they arrived at the table, the silence was immediate and heavy. Marianne looked at Helen with an expression that mixed curiosity and something that could be interpreted as poorly disguised disdain. The other guests seemed not to know how to react. "Everyone," said Richard, trying to keep his voice firm, "I'd like you to meet Helen and Mrs. Teresa Montgomery." Teresa greeted the group with the natural elegance of someone who was accustomed to navigating complex social circles. Helen, meanwhile, remained standing, clearly hesitant. "Please sit down," said Richard, pulling out chairs for the two women. "Richard," murmured Marianne, "can we talk in private?" "Later," he replied, turning his attention to Helen. "You said you needed help. How can I help you?" Helen looked around the table, seeing the curious faces that were not entirely friendly, and then fixed her eyes on Richard. "I don't understand. What's happening here? Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Being kind to me. Inviting me to sit with people who clearly don't want me here." She gestured vaguely toward the group. "I'm not an idiot. I can see how they're looking at me." "Helen," Teresa intervened gently, "why don't you first tell me what brought you here?" "Tonight?" Helen hesitated, clearly struggling with the vulnerability of having to expose her situation. I lost my job 3 months ago. Then I lost my apartment. I've been sleeping in some places. Not very comfortable. She took a deep breath before continuing. I remembered that you were always kind to me when I worked at the boutique on Fifth Avenue a few years ago. I thought that maybe you could help me find something, anything. You worked at my boutique? Asked Teresa, surprised. I'm sorry, dear, but I don't remember. I was a saleswoman there for 6 months in 2019, explained Helen. You always greeted all the employees by name. Helen Martinez. I was blonde then and wore glasses. Recognition dawned in Teresa's eyes. My God, Helen, of course I remember. You were one of the best saleswomen we ever had. Always polite, dedicated. What happened? Why did you leave? Helen lowered her eyes. My mother got sick. I needed to take care of her, and things got complicated. When I came back looking for work, the market was difficult. And since then you haven't been able to find a job? Asked Teresa, her voice full of genuine concern. I got some temporary jobs, but nothing stable, and when you don't have a fixed address, it gets even harder. Helen looked quickly at Richard. That's why I don't understand why this man is being kind to me. People like you usually cross the street when they see people like me. People like you? Asked Richard. People who clearly don't belong in this world, replied Helen, gesturing to the elegant surroundings. And what if I said that maybe that's exactly why you're important? Helen stared at him with an expression that mixed confusion and irritation. That doesn't make any sense. Many important things don't make sense at first, said Richard. Helen, I made a declaration a few minutes ago, a declaration that may sound absurd, but that I'm willing to honor. What kind of declaration? Edward leaned forward, clearly desperate to interrupt what he saw as an imminent disaster. Richard, you don't need to do this. We can help the young lady in other ways. What declaration? Insisted Helen, ignoring Edward and focusing her intense green eyes on Richard. Richard felt the weight of the moment. He knew that what he was about to say would change everything, for him, for Helen, and for everyone at the table. But he also knew that backing down now would be betraying the first genuinely authentic decision he had made in years. I said I would marry the first woman who walked through that door, he said, pointing to the restaurant entrance. And that woman was you. The silence that followed was so deep that Richard could hear his own heart beating. Helen stared at him for long seconds, her face passing through a sequence of expressions: surprise, disbelief, and finally something that seemed to be a mixture of anger and amusement. Then, to everyone's surprise, she began to laugh. It was a genuine laugh, not hysterical, but full of an irony that cut through the tension of the situation like a sharp blade. You're joking, she said finally. You have to be joking. Helen's laughter echoed through the elegant environment of Belle Epoque like a discordant note in a classical symphony. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of pure incredulity at the absurdity of the situation in which she found herself. You really think I'm going to believe that? She said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. A rich, well-dressed man, surrounded by equally rich people, decides he's going to marry me. A woman he's never seen in his life because I had the misfortune to enter the restaurant at the wrong time. Richard maintained a serious expression, not shaken by her reaction. I know how this sounds, Helen, but I'm serious. Serious? Helen abruptly stood up, making the chair scrape against the marble floor. Is this some kind of fetish? A rich fantasy of saving the poor thing? Or is it a cruel bet between you and your rich friends? Helen, please sit down, Teresa asked, concerned about the young woman's growing agitation. No, Mrs. Montgomery, I shouldn't have come here. Helen looked around the table, seeing the embarrassed faces of the guests. You must all be having a great time with this. The dirty, desperate woman who came fishing for a millionaire husband. No one is thinking that, said Richard, standing up as well. And it's not a cruel bet, Helen. It's what? She interrupted him, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and pain. Is it your good deed for the year? Your way of feeling better about yourself? Marianne, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. Helen, isn't it? Her voice was controlled, but there was a coldness that didn't go unnoticed. Perhaps you should listen to what Richard has to say before making hasty judgments. Helen turned to her, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, her eyes showed a spark of something dangerous. And you are? Marianne, Richard's girlfriend. Ex-girlfriend, corrected Richard quickly, earning a fierce look. From Marianne. Interesting, said Helen, crossing her arms. So you break up with your girlfriend in front of everyone to marry a complete stranger. That makes this whole situation even more bizarre. Things are more complicated than they seem, Richard tried to explain. Oh, are they? Helen took a few steps toward the exit. Well, no matter how complicated your existential issues are, I won't be part of your crazy therapy. Helen, wait. Richard reached her before she got to the door. Please, give me a chance to explain. Explain what? She turned to him, and Richard could see that behind the anger, there was a vulnerability she was struggling to hide. That you're a bored rich man who decided to play with the life of a desperate woman. That's not it, said Richard, lowering his voice. Helen, you're right about one thing. I'm a bored rich man, but I'm not playing with your life. I'm trying to find meaning for mine. And you think I'm the answer to your problems? I think you represent something that I lost a long time ago. What? Authenticity, replied Richard, surprising himself with the honesty of his own answer. You walked in here being exactly who you are, without masks, without pretense, and I don't remember the last time I was genuinely myself. Helen studied him for a few seconds, as if trying to detect signs of lying or manipulation. That still doesn't justify this crazy marriage proposal. You're right, agreed Richard. It's crazy, but what if it wasn't really about marriage? What if it was about giving ourselves a chance to discover who we really are when we're not playing? Roles that others expected us to play. You're speaking in riddles, said Helen, but Richard noticed that her posture had relaxed slightly. Let me be clearer, he said. I'm proposing that we get to know each other. Really. Without pressures, without predefined expectations, without timelines. And the marriage part? Richard hesitated. That was an impulsive declaration I made when I was feeling suffocated by the predictability of my life. But now that you're here, I realize that perhaps what's important isn't the marriage itself, but the possibility of building something real. Helen stared at him in silence for several seconds. Richard could see that she was processing what he had said, weighing the possibilities against the risks. And what exactly are you proposing? She asked finally. First, let me help you with your immediate situation. You need a place to stay, you need clean clothes, you need a decent meal. In exchange for what? For nothing, replied Richard, just for your company, for your time, for the chance to get to know you better. That sounds very much like a sugar daddy arrangement, said Helen, but there was less sharpness in her voice. It would be if there were immediate physical or romantic expectations, replied Richard. But there aren't. I'm suggesting that we spend time together as two people who want to discover who they really are when they remove the masks that society forces them to wear. Teresa, who had approached discreetly during the conversation, decided to intervene. Helen, may I suggest something? Of course, Mrs. Montgomery. Why don't you accept his help for tonight? Take a bath, eat a decent meal, sleep in a clean bed. Tomorrow you can think more clearly about what you want to do. And what if he's a maniac? Asked Helen, but there was an almost playful tone in her voice. Then I'll have his address and I'll call the police, replied Teresa with a smile. Besides, I've known the Blackwell family for years. Richard may be many things, but a maniac isn't one of them. Helen looked from Teresa to Richard, clearly still undecided. And if I accept this strange proposal, what happens next? Then we decide together, said Richard, one day at a time. No pressure? No pressure. And I can leave any time? Of course. Helen sighed deeply, and Richard could see the exact moment when she made her decision. All right, she said. One night. Let's see what happens. A murmur went through the restaurant. Richard had forgotten that they were still the center of attention of practically everyone present. He offered his arm to Helen, but she shook her head. Not yet, she said. I need time to process all this. I understand, said Richard. Shall we? They walked back to the table, where the group awaited them with expressions ranging from curiosity to open disapproval. Edward stood up immediately. "Richard, this is madness," he said in a low voice. "You don't know anything about this woman." "That's exactly the point, Edward," replied Richard. "I want to get to know her." Marianne also stood up, picking up her purse. "I think it's time for me to leave," she said, her voice controlled but cold. "Clearly I no longer have a place at this table." "Marianne, it doesn't have to be like this," said Richard. "Doesn't it?" She laughed bitterly. "Richard, you just ended our 2-year relationship to marry a complete stranger. How exactly should I react? I didn't say we were getting married," Richard tried to explain. "I said I wanted to get to know her better." "The difference is irrelevant to me," said Marianne, heading to the exit. "When you tire of this fantasy and want to return to the real world, let me know." After Marianne's dramatic exit, an uncomfortable silence settled at the table. Helen observed the entire interaction with a thoughtful expression. "I made you lose your girlfriend," she said to Richard. "No," he replied. "My own choices did that, and perhaps it's time to make choices based on what I really want, not on what's expected of me." Helen studied him with a new intensity. "And are you sure you know what you want?" "No," admitted Richard, "but for the first time in years, I'm interested in finding out." Teresa observed the interaction with a subtle smile. "Well," she said, "this promises to be interesting." Edward shook his head in defeat. "I give up. Richard, you're on your own in this madness." "I know," said Richard, looking at Helen, "and I'm okay with that." Helen took a deep breath and looked around the table one last time. "So," she said, "where do we start?" Richard's apartment on the Upper East Side was exactly what Helen had imagined it would be: impeccable, expensive, and completely impersonal. As the private elevator silently ascended to the top floor, she wondered for the 100th time if she had made the right decision by accepting this insane proposal. "Are you okay?" asked Richard, noticing the tension in her shoulders. "Defining." "Okay," replied Helen, watching the digital numbers marking the floors. "If you're asking if I'm having a nervous breakdown, the answer is no. If you're asking if I fully understand what I've gotten myself into, the answer is also no." The elevator doors opened directly into an elegantly decorated private hall. Richard entered a code on the panel next to a dark mahogany door, and it opened to reveal the interior of the apartment. Helen took a few steps inside and stopped, genuinely impressed. The space was large and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the illuminated city. The decor was minimalist but sophisticated, dominated by neutral tones and design pieces that she recognized from architecture magazines. "It's beautiful," she said genuinely. "Thank you," replied Richard, observing her as she explored the environment with her eyes. "But you don't seem impressed." Helen turned to him, a small smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I am impressed with the beauty and elegance, but I can also see that this place says nothing about who you really are." "What do you mean?" "It's like a showroom from a magazine. Everything perfect, everything in the right place, but there's no life here, no personality." She pointed to the empty bookshelves, the walls without personal photographs, the complete absence of any object that would suggest hobbies or personal interests. "It's as if no one really lived here." Richard looked around his own apartment, trying to see it through her eyes. "I never thought about it that way." "Probably because you're so used to living a life without personality that you don't even notice anymore," said Helen, and then immediately seemed to regret the harshness of the comment. "I'm sorry, that was rude." "No, it was honest," said Richard. "And you're right, this place is an extension of the life I've been living, beautiful on the surface, but empty of real meaning." Helen walked to the panoramic windows and looked at the city below. "It must be lonely," she said softly. "It is," admitted Richard, approaching her, "more than I'd like to admit." They stood in silence for a few moments, observing the city lights. Helen was aware of his proximity, the subtle and expensive smell of his cologne, the way he breathed. The intimacy of the moment was strange, considering they had met just a few hours ago. "Well," she said finally, moving away from the window. "You mentioned a bath and clean clothes. I'm assuming you have a bathroom in this palace." Richard smiled, the first genuine smile Helen had seen from him. "I have a few. Let me show you the guest room." He led her down a hallway to a spacious and elegantly furnished room with its own complete suite. Helen looked around, noting that even the guest room was more luxurious than any place she had ever lived. "The towels are in the bathroom cabinet," said Richard. "I'll arrange some clothes for you. What's your size?" Helen hesitated. "Richard, about the clothes. I don't want you to feel like you need to dress me like a doll to fit me into your world." "It's not about fitting you anywhere," he said. "It's about you having clean and comfortable clothes." "Even so," insisted Helen, "I don't want anything too expensive or elaborate, just something simple and practical." "Understood," said Richard. "Size M?" "That's right." After Richard left, Helen locked the door and allowed herself a moment to process the surreal situation she found herself in. A few hours earlier, she had been sleeping on a park bench with a few coins in her pocket and not knowing where her next meal would come from. Now she was in a penthouse apartment, about to take a bath in a bathroom that probably cost more than most people earn in a year. The bath was a revelation. Helen had forgotten how good it felt to have hot water running over her body, to use real shampoo instead of cheap soap, to feel truly clean. She stayed under the shower much longer than necessary, simply enjoying the sensation of basic luxury she had lost months ago. When she finally got out of the bath, she found a set of clothes carefully folded on the bed, good quality but not ostentatious jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and even underwear still with tags. There was also a pair of casual sneakers that seemed to be exactly her size. Dressed and feeling human again, Helen found Richard in the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be an elaborate sandwich. "You cook?" she asked, surprised. "I define that very liberally," he replied, smiling. "But I know how to make some basic things. I thought you might be hungry." Helen sat on one of the stools at the central island in the kitchen and observed Richard work. There was something almost domestic about the scene, which was ironic considering the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "Richard," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "Of course." "Why are you really doing this? And don't give me that answer about authenticity and finding meaning. What's the real reason?" Richard stopped cutting the tomato and looked at her directly. "You want the truth?" "Always." "I was feeling like I was dying inside," he said, his voice low but clear. "Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Each day was the same as the one before. Each conversation was predictable. Each decision was already made even before I thought about it." He placed the sandwich in front of her and sat on the other side of the island. "And then, in a moment of, I don't know, desperation, rebellion, I made that absurd declaration. And when you walked through that door, I realized I was being presented with an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "The opportunity to do something real, something unpredicted, something that could remind me of what it's like to be alive." Helen bit into the sandwich, which was surprisingly good, and studied him as she chewed. "And if that opportunity isn't what you expect? What if I'm a disappointment? What if you're not?" "Richard, you need to understand something about me," said Helen, putting the sandwich back on the plate. "I'm not a charity project. I'm not a lost soul waiting to be saved by a knight in shining armor. I don't think of you that way." "Are you sure?" "Because it would be very easy for you to see yourself as my savior, and for me to become dependent on your generosity. And that would be toxic for both of us." Richard considered her words carefully. "You're right. That's a real risk. How do we avoid that?" "By establishing clear boundaries," said Helen, "and realistic expectations." "Like what?" "First, what you're offering, the lodging, the clothes, the food, can't come with invisible strings. I won't feel obligated to be grateful in a way you consider appropriate." "I agree." "Second, I'm going to look for work immediately. I won't become an expensive pet." "Helen, You don't need to rush. Yes, I do, she interrupted him firmly. I need to maintain my independence and my dignity. And that means not living at your expense indefinitely. I understand, said Richard. Anything else? Yes. If at any point one of us decides that this isn't working, we should be honest about it. No drama, no guilt, no attempts to force something. That isn't natural. Agreed, said Richard, extending his hand. Partners in this crazy experiment. Helen looked at the outstretched hand and, after a moment of hesitation, shook it. Partners, she agreed. But I still think you're crazy. I probably am, admitted Richard, but it's the first time in years that I feel completely sane. Helen finished her sandwich in silence, processing everything that had happened. When she finished, she looked at Richard with a thoughtful expression. So, she said, what do we do now? Now you rest, said Richard. Tomorrow we can start figuring out how this is going to work. And you? What are you going to do? Richard looked around his impeccable and empty apartment. Honestly, I have no idea. Maybe it's time to discover who I am when I'm not trying to be who everyone expects me to be. Helen smiled, the first genuine smile she had given since entering the restaurant. Well, she said, that promises to be interesting. Helen woke up disoriented, taking a few seconds to remember where she was. The bed was incredibly comfortable. The sheets had a soft touch she had forgotten existed, and for the first time in months she had slept an entire night without being awakened by street noises or the cold. She looked at the clock on the nightstand, 9:30 in the morning. She hadn't slept this late in a long time. On the street she always woke up with the first ray of sunlight, by survival instinct. She got up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains. The morning view of the city was different from the night before, less dramatic, more real. She could see people walking on the sidewalks below, cars in traffic, everyday life happening at a safe distance. A soft knock on the door brought her back to reality. "Helen, are you awake?" It was Richard's voice. "I am," she replied. "Just a minute." She quickly dressed in the clothes from the day before and opened the door. Richard was there with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, wearing a casual t-shirt and jeans, a much more relaxed version of the suited man she had met the night before. "Good morning," he said, offering the cup. "I thought you might want coffee." "Thank you," said Helen, accepting the cup and appreciating the rich aroma. "Did you sleep well?" "Actually, not very much," admitted Richard. "I stayed awake most of the night thinking about everything that happened." "Regrets?" asked Helen, studying his expression. "No," he said, seeming genuinely surprised by his own answer. "Absolutely none. And you?" Helen took a sip of the coffee, which was perfect, before answering. "I'm trying not to overanalyze, one thing at a time, remember?" "Right, well, the first thing is breakfast. Do you eat eggs?" "I eat anything that isn't spoiled," said Helen, and then realized how that sounded. "Sorry, I'm still adjusting to all of this." "You don't need to apologize for being honest," said Richard. "Let's go to the kitchen." While Richard prepared a simple but substantial breakfast, Helen observed how he moved around the kitchen. There was a precision in his movements that suggested he really did know how to cook, at least the basics. "Where did you learn to cook?" she asked. "My grandmother," replied Richard, smiling at the memory. "When I was a child, I used to spend vacations at her farm in upstate New York. She said that every man should know how to take care of himself. She seems to have been a wise woman." She was. She also said that money doesn't replace character, and that the most interesting people are those who have been through difficulties and haven't lost their humanity. Helen stopped stirring her coffee and looked at him. "Is that why you're doing this? Because of some lesson from your grandmother?" "Maybe in part," admitted Richard, "but mainly because when I look at you, I see something that I lost along the way." "What do you see?" "Real courage, genuine strength. The ability to be yourself even when the whole world is telling you to be someone else." Helen was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "Richard, you need to stop idealizing me. I'm not a saint or a heroine. I'm just a woman who made some bad choices and had some setbacks in life." "Tell me about them," he said, serving scrambled eggs on her plate. "The bad choices or the setbacks?" "Both. I want to know you for real, Helen. not the edited version. Helen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Why is this important to you? Because if we're going to do this, whatever this is, it needs to be based on truth, not on fantasies or projections. Helen took a forkful of eggs, buying time to think. All right, she said finally, but you're going to hear things that might change your opinion about me. I'm willing to take that risk. Helen took a deep breath. I grew up in East Harlem, raised by my mother. I never knew my father. My mother worked as a cleaner, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs to be able to pay the bills. She stopped to drink more coffee, clearly organizing her thoughts. I was a good student, got a scholarship to study business administration. It seemed like things were finally improving. I got the job at Mrs. Montgomery's boutique, was saving money to help my mother stop working so much. What happened? My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. Helen paused, and Richard could see the still, fresh pain in her eyes. I dropped out of college and quit my job to take care of her. I spent all our savings on treatments that private medicine promised would work better than what was available through Medicaid. Helen. She passed away after 8 months of suffering, continued Helen, her voice becoming firmer, and I was left with enormous debts from hospitals, without work, without a complete education, and I discovered that our house had been mortgaged to pay for treatments that didn't work. Richard remained silent, understanding that she needed to tell the story in her own way. For a while I got some temporary jobs, shared an apartment with other girls, but when the economic crisis got worse, I was one of the first to be fired from any job. Without recent references, without a complete education, without family to help me, things went from bad to worse. How did you end up on the street? Lost the last apartment I shared 3 months ago. I tried staying with some acquaintances, but I couldn't abuse their generosity indefinitely. Helen shrugged, as if she were talking about the weather. I discovered that there are places in the city where you can sleep without being bothered, where you can shower occasionally, where you can get a meal. And yesterday, how did you decide to look for Mrs. Montgomery? Desperation, said Helen with brutal honesty. I had gone 2 days without eating anything substantial. I remembered that she was always kind to me, and I thought that maybe she could help me get some work, even if it was cleaning. Richard finished eating in silence, absorbing everything she had told him. Helen, he said finally, thank you for trusting me with this. Now you understand why I said you might change your opinion about me. I'm not a romantic victim of circumstances. I'm a 30-year-old woman who lost everything and ended up on the street. You know what I see when I hear that story? Asked Richard. A woman who made bad choices. A woman who sacrificed everything to care for someone she loved. A woman who faced adversities that would break many people, but who still maintains her dignity and humanity intact. Helen looked at him with skepticism. Richard, you don't need to try to make me feel better about my situation. I'm not trying to make you feel better. I'm telling you what I really see. And what do you see when you look at your own life? Asked Helen, turning the tables. Since we're being honest. Richard was quiet for a long moment. I see a man who never had to make truly difficult choices, who never sacrificed anything for someone he loved, who built a comfortable but empty life, surrounded by people who know him only superficially. That sounds like self-pity, observed Helen. It probably is, admitted Richard, but it's also honest. Helen finished her coffee and looked at him with a thoughtful expression. So here we are. The woman who lost everything and the man who has everything but doesn't feel like he has anything. An unlikely pair, agreed Richard. The question is, what do we do now? Richard stood up and began to collect the plates. Now you help me. Wash the dishes, and then we'll figure out how 2 completely different people can learn something from each other. Helen smiled, a small smile but genuine. You really think this can work? I have no idea, admitted Richard. But for the first time in years, I'm curious to find out. Helen stood up and picked up some plates. Well, she said, at least it won't be boring. As they washed the dishes together, a surprisingly domestic and natural activity, both were lost in their own thoughts. Helen wondered if she was being naive to trust this man she barely knew. Richard questioned whether he was being fair to Helen by involving her in his search for meaning. But for now, in the comfortable silence of the morning kitchen, both felt something they hadn't experienced in a long time, the possibility that things could be different. The second week in Helen's life in Richard's apartment had established a strange but comfortable routine. She woke up early, prepared coffee for both of them, and then went out to look for work while Richard took care of his business. In the evening, they met for dinner and conversations that ranged from trivial to deeply personal. That Thursday morning, Helen was preparing to leave when Richard appeared in the living room with a nervous expression. "Helen," he said, "I need to tell you something." She stopped adjusting the strap of the simple purse he had bought for her. "You have the face of someone who's going to give bad news. It's not bad necessarily, but it's complicated." Richard took a deep breath. "My family is organizing a charity dinner next Saturday. It's an annual event that I can't miss." Helen sat on the sofa, sensing where the conversation was going. "And you want me to go with you?" "I'd like you to consider the possibility," said Richard, sitting beside her. "But I understand if you don't want to. It's going to be intense." "Intense? How?" 300 people from New York high society, many questions about who you are and where you came from, curious looks, gossip that will last for months. Helen laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. "Are you inviting me to be a zoo animal?" "No," said Richard firmly. "I'm inviting you to be my date because I want you to be there, because you've become important to me, and this is a part of my life." "Richard, I don't have appropriate clothes for this kind of event. I don't know how to behave in these circles. I'm going to embarrass you." "First, you could never embarrass me. Second, we can solve the clothing issue. And third, you behave by being exactly who you are." Helen stood up and walked to the window, observing the city below. "You don't understand. These people will see me arriving and immediately know that I don't belong in your world. They'll judge you for being with me." "Let them judge," said Richard, approaching her. "Helen, during these 2 weeks, you've shown me more authenticity and truth than I've seen in years from those people. If they can't see the value in who you are, the problem is theirs, not yours. And what if I say something wrong? What if I use the wrong fork, or don't know what kind of wine to talk about?" Richard placed his hands on her shoulders, making her turn to face him. "Helen, you've been through much harder things than a fancy dinner. You took care of your mother during the most difficult phase of her life. You survived on the streets, keeping your dignity intact. Do you really think a group of rich and bored people can intimidate you?" Helen looked at him for a long moment. "When you put it that way, so you'll go?" "I'll think about it," she said. "But first, I need to continue looking for work. I have an interview this afternoon at a cleaning company." "Helen, about that, you don't have to accept just any job to prove a point." "I need to work, Richard. I need to support myself." "I know, but perhaps we can find something more suited to your qualifications." Helen stopped halfway to the door. "What do you mean?" "Well, you have experience in sales. You almost completed your business administration degree. Maybe we can find something in one of the companies I invest in." "No," said Helen firmly. "Why not?" "Because I don't want people to say I got a job only because I'm sleeping with the boss." "But you're not sleeping with me," pointed out Richard. "They don't know that. And frankly, our situation is already strange enough without adding a professional relationship to the mix." Richard considered her words. "You have a point. But at least let me help you with preparation for interviews. I can review your resume, do some simulations." Helen smiled, the first genuine smile of the conversation. "That I accept. Thank you." After Helen left, Richard was alone with his thoughts. The truth was that he wanted her to go to the charity dinner for more selfish reasons than he had admitted. He wanted to show the world, and especially his family, that he had found something real, someone who saw him for who he really was, not for what he possessed. But he was also genuinely nervous about how his family would react to Helen, especially his mother, Isabella Blackwell, a woman who had spent her entire life navigating and controlling elite social circles. As if invoked by his thoughts, his phone rang. It was exactly her. "Richard, darling," said the elegant voice of his mother, "I need to speak with you about Saturday's dinner." "Hi, Mum. What happened?" "I heard some rumors." "Concerning?" "Edward said that you ended things with Marianne quite dramatically, and that there's a new woman in your life." Richard sighed. He should have expected that Edward wouldn't be able to keep his mouth shut. "It's true. And you're going to bring her to the dinner?" "I'm thinking about it." "Richard, you understand the importance of this event. We're raising funds for the Children's Hospital. There will be journalists present, members of the city government." "I know, Mum. Then you understand why I need to know something about this woman before Saturday." Richard prepared himself for the storm that was coming. "Her name is Helen. She's intelligent, kind, honest, and one of the most principled people I've ever met." "That's wonderful, darling. What's her family? Where did she study?" "She grew up in East Harlem. She studied business administration, but didn't finish the course because she needed to take care of her sick mother." There was a significant pause on the other end of the line. "I see. And currently she works as what?" "She's looking for work." Another pause, longer this time. "Richard, are you telling me that you're going to bring an unemployed woman from the inner city to the most important event of the year for our family?" "I'm telling you that I'm going to bring the woman I'm involved with," said Richard, feeling the irritation grow. "And frankly, Mum, the fact that you're more concerned with her zip code than with her character says a lot about your priorities." "Don't be dramatic, Richard. Of course, character is important, but you need to understand that certain expectations come with our social position. Maybe it's time we question those expectations." "Richard Elliot Blackwell," said Isabella, using his full name in the way she always did when she was genuinely irritated. "Are you going through some kind of midlife crisis?" "Maybe," admitted Richard, "or maybe I'm finally growing up." "Well," said Isabella after a moment, "I suppose I can't stop you, but for God's sake, at least make sure she's properly dressed." "She will be," promised Richard. After hanging up the phone, Richard headed to his office, but had difficulty concentrating on work. He was genuinely concerned about how Saturday night would unfold, not so much for Helen, he was sure she would do fine, but for his family and friends. It would be the first time they would see that he was serious about building a different life. That afternoon, when Helen returned from the interview, she seemed more excited than she had been in days. "How was it?" asked Richard. "Better than I expected," said Helen, taking off her shoes. "The manager said she liked my sales background, and that she'll call me for a second interview next week." "That's great." "It is, and it made me think about what you said this morning about the dinner." Richard looked at her expectantly. "I'll go," said Helen, "but with some conditions." "What are they?" "First, no trying to transform me into someone I'm not. If you want me to go, it's as Helen, not as a manufactured version of a socialite." "I completely agree." "Second, you need to prepare me for what I'm going to face. Who are the important people? What kind of questions they'll ask? How this type of event works? I can do that." "And third," Helen hesitated, "you need to be prepared for the possibility that this doesn't go well, that I might say something that embarrasses you, or that your people don't accept me." Richard approached her and took her hands. "Helen, you could embarrass me if you tried to be someone you're not. You could never embarrass me by being yourself. You have a lot of faith in me." "I have faith in us," corrected Richard. "And I have faith that together we can face anything they throw at us." Helen smiled, but her eyes still showed nervousness. "So, when do we start preparation for this big test?" "How about now?" suggested Richard. "We can start with a crash course on the New York elite and their peculiarities." "This is going to be interesting," said Helen, sitting on the sofa. "Tell me about your family." And so, as afternoon turned into evening, Richard began to prepare Helen for what would undoubtedly be one of the most important and challenging nights of their lives together. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparations that transformed Richard's apartment into a kind of training camp for social navigation. Helen had insisted that she wanted to be prepared for any situation, and Richard took that responsibility very seriously. "So, if someone asks about my family," said Helen, practicing for the 10th time that morning. "You talk about your mother." "With pride," replied Richard. "She worked hard her whole life to give you opportunities. That's something any decent person will respect. And if they ask about my current job, you say you're exploring new professional opportunities after spending time taking care of personal family matters." Helen laughed, shaking her head. "You're very good at transforming uncomfortable truths into socially acceptable statements." "It's an unfortunately necessary skill in these circles," admitted Richard. "But Helen, remember, you're not lying. You're just presenting the facts in the most dignified way possible." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Richard went to answer it and returned accompanied by an elegant woman in her 50s, carrying several clothing bags. "Helen," said Richard, "this is Sophia Reynolds, personal stylist. Sophia, Helen." Sophia greeted Helen with a professional but genuinely warm smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Richard told me we need to find something perfect for Saturday night." "With all due respect," said Helen, "I don't want to look like a well-dressed puppet." "Dear," said Sophia, "my job isn't to transform you into someone else. It's to find clothes that enhance who you already are. May I see your work?" For the next hour, Helen tried on different dresses, shoes, and accessories. Sophia had an exceptional eye for what worked with Helen's physical type and personality, rejecting anything that seemed too ostentatious or that didn't fit her natural style. "This one," said Sophia when Helen emerged from the bedroom wearing a navy blue dress with a simple but elegant cut. "This is perfect." Richard, who had been working on his laptop during most of the session, looked up and literally lost his breath. The dress was sophisticated without being flashy, accentuated Helen's figure without being vulgar, and the color perfectly complemented her green eyes. "You look beautiful," he said, genuinely impressed. Helen looked at herself in the mirror, and for the first time seemed satisfied with what she saw. "I don't feel like I'm wearing a costume," she said. "I feel like a more elegant version of myself." "Exactly the goal," said Sophia, satisfied. "Now let's talk about shoes and accessories." That afternoon, after Sophia left, Helen and Richard continued the social rehearsals. Richard had created scenarios based on real conversations he had witnessed at similar events. "Role play," he announced. "I'm Constance Alden, wife of the owner of the largest supermarket chain in the state. I'm known for asking indiscreet questions disguised as social interest." Helen laughed. "You're going to make a terrible drag queen." "Very funny, now be serious." Richard changed his posture and expression, assuming an air of poorly disguised superiority. "Darling, what a lovely dress. It must have cost a fortune. Where do you usually shop?" Helen considered for a moment. "Thank you for the compliment. Actually, I have a wonderful stylist who helps me find pieces that work for different occasions." "Well played," said Richard, returning to normal. "You deflected the question about money and still sounded sophisticated. And if she insists?" "Then you change the subject." "Speaking of dresses, yours is stunning. Who is the designer?" People like Constance love to talk about themselves. They practiced different scenarios, conversations about art. Helen learned some phrases about Richard's favorite artists: politics, staying neutral and diplomatic, and business, focusing on general concepts instead of specific details. "And if someone is really hostile," asked Helen, "if someone is deliberately rude?" "Then you smile, maintain your dignity, and find me," said Richard firmly. "But honestly, most of these people are social cowards. They may gossip afterwards, but they're rarely confrontational face-to-face. And your family, how will they react?" Richard hesitated. "My mother will be polite but distant. She'll be discreetly evaluating you all night. My father will probably treat you with basic cordiality. He's more focused on business than on social politics. My cousins, well, Edward you already know." "Is he still upset?" "Edward will get over it. He gets dramatic for a few weeks and then forgets." On Friday night, Helen was visibly nervous. They had finished dinner, but she had barely touched her food. "Helen," said Richard, "do you want to cancel? We can still do that." "No," she said firmly. "I won't run away. But can I ask you a personal question?" "Always." "Why is this so important to you? Really, it's not just about introducing me to your friends. There's something more." Richard put his fork on his plate and looked at her directly. "You're right, there is something more." "What?" "I want them to see that I've changed, that I'm no longer the same man who blindly followed their expectations, that I found something real and I'm willing to fight for it. And if they can't see that, then at least I'll know that I tried to be honest about who I've become." Helen reached across the table and touched his hand. "Richard, you don't need to use me to prove a point to your family." "It's not that," he said, turning his hand to intertwine his fingers with hers. "Helen, these 3 weeks with you have been the most real of my adult life. You show me every day what it means to be authentic, to be brave, to be true to yourself." "I do that?" "You do, when you refuse to accept charity, when you insist on looking for work, when you call me on my nonsense. You're teaching me to be a better person." Helen was quiet for a long moment. "And what if I can't? What if I say something wrong tomorrow and embarrass you in front of all these important people?" "Then we'll face the consequences together," said Richard. "Helen, I'd rather be judged for being with someone genuine like you than be accepted for being with someone who is appropriate but empty." "Are you sure about that?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Helen smiled, a small smile but real. "Then I guess I better get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Helen?" "Yes?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For agreeing to do this, for giving me the chance to show the world who I really want to be." Helen stood up and leaned over to kiss his forehead, a surprisingly intimate gesture that made Richard's heart race. "Thank you for making me feel like I'm worth it," she said softly. As Helen retired to her room, Richard remained at the dining table, processing the conflicting emotions he had developed for her in the past weeks. What had begun as an impulsive bet had become something much deeper and more complicated. He was falling in love with Helen. That was undeniable. But he also knew that she had made it clear from the beginning that she didn't want to be a charity project or a salvation fantasy. She wanted to be seen as an equal, and that meant that any real relationship between them would have to be built on a foundation of mutual respect and independence. Tomorrow would be a test not only for Helen, but for both of them. A test to see if what they had built together could survive the scrutiny of Richard's world. And for the first time in his life, Richard was genuinely nervous about what the future might bring. The Plaza Hotel had been transformed into a scene of dazzling elegance for the annual charity dinner of the Blackwell Foundation. Golden lights created a magical atmosphere in the main hall, where round tables covered with white linen tablecloths accommodated New York's elite. The soft sound of a string quartet mingled with the murmur of sophisticated conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses. Helen observed all this from the back seat of Richard's car, trying to control the nerves that threatened to overwhelm her. The navy blue dress fit perfectly, the shoes were surprisingly comfortable, and she felt for the first time in months like a polished version of herself. "Are you okay?" asked Richard, noticing her tension. "Defining okay," replied Helen, echoing a phrase that had become a private joke between them. "My heart is beating as if I'm about to give a presentation to 1,000 people." "Technically, it's only 300, said Richard with a smile. "Very reassuring," said Helen dryly. The car stopped at the hotel entrance, where a red carpet extended from the sidewalk to the main door. Photographers from the social press were strategically positioned, capturing the arrival of important guests. "Are they going to take pictures of us?" asked Helen, suddenly alarmed. "Probably," admitted Richard. "But don't worry, just smile naturally, and keep walking." The doorman opened the car door and Richard got out first, offering his hand to Helen. The moment she emerged from the vehicle, elegant and confident despite her internal nervousness, was captured by several cameras. She smiled, as Richard had suggested, and together they walked down the red carpet. "Richard!" A familiar voice intercepted them before they reached the entrance. It was Marianne, stunning in a gold dress that probably cost more than many people's annual salary. "What a surprise to see you here." "Marianne," Richard greeted her politely. "You look beautiful as always." Marianne smiled, but her eyes were fixed on Helen with an intensity that made the latter feel as if she were being dissected. "And you must be Helen. I've heard so much about you." "Nice to meet you," said Helen, keeping her voice firm. "The pleasure is mine," said Marianne, her smile becoming sharper. "What an interesting dress. Very discreet." Helen felt the subtle provocation, but remembered Richard's advice about maintaining dignity. "Thank you, you look stunning as well." "Well," said Marianne, "I hope you enjoy yourselves tonight. It's always educational to see how different people react to these events." After Marianne walked away, Helen looked at Richard. "Did she just insult me?" "In a very subtle way, yes," admitted Richard, "but you handled it perfectly." "And that was just the warm-up?" "I'm afraid so." The interior of the hotel was even more impressive than the exterior. Helen tried not to look obviously amazed at the crystal chandeliers, the marble columns, and the floral arrangements that probably cost more than her old monthly rent. "Richard!" An elegant woman in her 60s approached them. Even without introductions, Helen immediately knew this was Isabella Blackwell, the family matriarch. The resemblance to Richard was undeniable, as was the air of natural authority she carried. "Mom," said Richard, kissing her cheek. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, darling." Isabella turned to Helen with a smile that was polite but not exactly warm. "And you must be Helen. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Blackwell," said Helen, aware that she was being evaluated in every word and gesture. "Please call me Isabella. Richard told me that you met in quite a romantic way." Helen caught the hesitation in the word romantic and understood that Richard had considerably edited the real story. "Your son is a very special man," she said diplomatically. "Yes, he is," agreed Isabella. "I'm looking forward to getting to know you better during the evening. Richard rarely introduces us to his friends." The pause before friends was deliberate, and Helen felt the weight of the barely disguised disapproval. But before she could respond, a tall and distinguished man approached the group. "Helen," said Richard, "this is my father, Robert Blackwell." Robert greeted Helen with more genuine cordiality than his wife. "It's a pleasure, Helen. Richard has been talking a lot about you." "Good things, I hope," said Helen, relaxing slightly. "Only good things," confirmed Robert with a smile. "He told us about your experience in sales. I've always admired people with a natural talent for connecting with others." "Thank you," said Helen, surprised and touched by the genuine kindness. "Well," interrupted Isabella, "I think we should find our places. Dinner is about to begin." As they walked to their tables, Helen noticed the discreet but persistent glances from the other guests. Some people seemed genuinely curious, others clearly disapproving, and a few seemed sympathetically interested. "Main table," murmured Richard in her ear. "This is going to be interesting." The main table included Richard's parents, Edward and his current wife, two couples of prominent business people, and a younger couple that Helen didn't recognize. "Helen," said Edward upon seeing her, his expression carefully neutral, "you look very elegant tonight." "Thank you, Edward," replied Helen, remembering to maintain cordiality despite the tense history. Introductions were made quickly. Helen was presented as Richard's special friend, a vague description that left room for much speculation. During the first course, the conversations were relatively safe. Comments about the decoration, the weather, recent events in the city. Helen contributed when appropriate, but mainly observed the group dynamics. It was during the main course that things got more interesting. "Helen," said one of the businesswomen, "Richard told us that you have experience in sales. In what sector?" "Fashion, mainly," replied Helen. "I worked in some boutiques over the years." "How interesting," said the woman. "I've always thought that sales is an art. It requires a real understanding of human nature." "I completely agree," said Helen, feeling more confident. "It's about listening to what people really need, not just what they say they want." Very insightful, commented Robert, clearly impressed. But then Constance Alden, exactly the woman Richard had warned Helen about, leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Helen, dear, where exactly did you grow up? Your way. Of speaking suggests interesting origins. The silence at the table was instantaneous. Helen felt all eyes on her and knew this was the crucial moment. She could try to dodge, create an edited version of her story, or, I grew up in East Harlem, she said clearly, without shame or defensiveness. My mother worked as a cleaner most of her life to give me opportunities she never had. I learned from her that dignity has nothing to do with zip code. The silence continued for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Then Robert began to smile. Your mother seems to have been a remarkable woman, he said. Women who raise children alone while working multiple jobs have my complete admiration. Was, corrected Helen softly. She passed away last year. I'm sorry for your loss, said Robert, his sympathy genuine. Constance seemed frustrated that her attempt at embarrassment had been neutralized. Well, she said, I imagine it must be interesting to adjust to such different circles. Actually, said Helen, looking directly at her, I've found that people are people regardless of how much money they have. The same insecurities, the same needs for connection, the same fears. The only real difference is that some people have more practice in hiding who they really are. This time, the silence was followed by a low laugh from Robert. Touché, he said. Helen, you are refreshingly direct. Isabella, who had remained largely silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Helen, may I ask what your future plans are? I'm currently exploring professional opportunities, said Helen, using the language that Richard had helped her develop. I'm also considering going back to school to finish my degree. In what area? Business administration. I've always been interested in how businesses work, especially small businesses. Interesting, said Isabella, and for the first time, Helen detected something that could have been genuine approval. Small businesses are the backbone of the economy. The rest of the dinner passed relatively smoothly. Helen participated in the conversations when appropriate, asked some intelligent questions about the other guests' businesses, and gradually felt the tension at the table diminish. During dessert, Richard leaned toward her. How are you feeling? Like, I've passed a test I didn't know I was taking, murmured Helen back. And you passed with flying colors, he said, his pride evident in his voice. But the night wasn't over yet. The real test was still to come. After the formal dinner, the guests were invited to move to the adjacent hall, where a small orchestra had replaced the string quartet, and a complete bar was available. It was the most social part of the night, where the real conversations happened and the real business was discussed. Helen observed the transition with fascination. It was like watching a choreographed social dance, where each person knew exactly where to position themselves and who to talk to. Groups formed and dissolved with a fluidity that seemed natural, but that she now understood was the result of years of practice. Impressed? Asked Richard, offering her a glass of champagne. It's like watching a ballet, said Helen. Everyone knows the steps. And now you do too, said a voice behind them. It was Teresa Montgomery, elegant in an embroidered burgundy silk dress. Helen, dear, what a wonderful transformation. Helen smiled genuinely for the first time that night. Mrs. Montgomery, it's so good to see you. The pleasure is mine. And please, just Teresa here. She looked Helen up and down with maternal approval. You look absolutely stunning, and more importantly, you're radiating confidence. I don't know about that, admitted Helen. I still feel like I'm playing a role. Dear, everyone here is playing roles, said Teresa with a low laugh. The difference is that you're being honest about it. Teresa, said Richard, thank you for talking to my mother earlier. Oh, Isabella just needed some reliable information, said Teresa with a mischievous smile. I told her about Helen's exemplary work ethic and her dedication to family. Sometimes context makes all the difference. Helen looked between them, realizing there were layers of social politics that she still didn't fully understand. You were talking about me? just ensuring that certain people understood your character before jumping to hasty conclusions, said Teresa diplomatically. At that moment, Edward approached the group, clearly already affected by the champagne. "Richard, I need to talk to you in private. Edward, perhaps later." "Now," insisted Edward, his tone suggesting that the conversation wouldn't be friendly. Richard looked at Helen with an apologetic expression. "Will you be okay with Teresa for a few minutes?" "Of course," said Helen, although she could see that Richard was genuinely reluctant to leave her. After the men walked away, Teresa turned to Helen with a more serious expression. "Dear, may I give you some advice?" "Always. Tonight you've done wonderfully well. You showed grace under pressure, maintained your dignity, and demonstrated that you belong in any environment you choose. But some people here tonight weren't happy about that. They would have preferred that you stumbled, gave them a reason to dismiss you as unsuitable." Helen felt a chill in her stomach. "And now? Now they'll try a different approach. Gossip, insinuations, attempts to find something in your past that they can use against you." "They'll find plenty," said Helen bitterly. "Dear, there's nothing in your past that you should be ashamed of. You took care of your mother, faced financial difficulties, struggled to survive. That's not a scandal. It's real life. But for these people, authenticity is threatening because it exposes the artificiality of their own lives," said Teresa firmly. "Don't let them make you feel less." Across the hall, the conversation between Richard and Edward was intensifying. "You've completely lost your mind," said Edward, his voice low but intense. "This woman is obviously an opportunist." "Edward, you don't know Helen." "I know what I see. A woman from the inner city who was literally on the street, and now suddenly is wearing expensive dresses and attending high society events. Don't you see the obvious?" "What I see," said Richard, his patience running out, "is a woman of integrity, who treats me like a human being, not like a bank account. Richard, wake up. She saw you coming from a mile away, a desperate woman, a rich and lonely man. It's the oldest con in the book." "Edward, I suggest you stop right there," warned Richard, his voice becoming dangerously low. "Or what? You're going to hit me? For defending you from an obvious gold digger?" "She's not a gold digger." "Prove it," challenged Edward. "Prove that she would be with you if you were poor." The question hit Richard in a way he hadn't expected. Not because he doubted Helen, but because it touched on his own deep insecurities about being loved for who he was versus what he possessed. "You're drunk," said Richard finally. "I'm lucid," replied Edward. "And as your cousin and friend, I'm trying to save you from yourself. I don't need to be saved." "No? Then why do you look so insecure about this whole situation?" Before Richard could respond, Constance Alden appeared beside them. "Excuse me for interrupting, but you're making a scene." Both men looked around and realized that their discussion had attracted curious glances from other guests. "Constance," said Edward with a forced smile, "we were just having a family discussion. About Richard's new friend, I imagine," said Constance with false sympathy. "I must say she presented herself very well tonight, much better than I expected." "What do you mean by that?" asked Richard. "Oh, nothing much. It's just that it's always interesting when someone from such a different background tries to integrate into our circles. It requires so much effort." "Helen isn't trying to integrate anywhere," said Richard. "She's being herself." "Of course she is," said Constance with a smile. That fooled no one. "Although I was curious about some details of her story. For example, how exactly did you meet?" Richard felt the trap closing. He knew that Constance had investigated and probably discovered the truth about the meeting at the restaurant. "We met through a mutual friend," he said, technically not lying. "How romantic," said Constance. "And where was she living before you moved in together?" "Why is that relevant?" asked Richard, his irritation growing. "Oh, just social curiosity," said Constance innocently. "It's just that I heard some rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Edward leaned forward, clearly interested. "Well," said Constance, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "I heard that she was in quite a precarious situation before meeting Richard. Some even said that she was... Constance interrupted. A firm voice. It was Isabella Blackwell who had approached silently. I hope you're not spreading gossip about my son's guest. Of course not, Isabella, said Constance, clearly uncomfortable with the matriarch's intervention. Just making social conversation. I see, said Isabella with a tone that clearly indicated otherwise. Perhaps we should focus on the reason we're all here tonight, raising funds for children in need. It was a polite but unequivocal reprimand, and Constance quickly retreated with muttered apologies. Mom, said Richard, surprised by the unexpected defense. I don't like malicious gossip at my events, said Isabella simply, regardless of the target. Edward looked between mother and son, clearly frustrated. You've all lost your minds, he muttered before walking away. Richard, said Isabella when they were alone, may I give you some advice? Of course. If you really care about this young woman, and it seems you do, you need to better protect her from gossip and scrutiny. People like Constance will continue attacking until they find something that sticks. And how do I do that? By being more discreet or by being more definitive, said Isabella. This ambiguous situation you have, here's leaving room for a lot of speculation. More definitive, how? Isabella studied him for a long moment. That's something you'll have to decide for yourself, darling. But decide soon. Ambiguity is rarely kind to anyone involved. Meanwhile, across the hall, Helen was having her own revealing conversation. Teresa had been called to speak with other friends, leaving Helen momentarily alone near the balcony. May I join you? Asked a soft voice. Helen turned to see a young and elegant woman whom she recognized from the main table. Of course, said Helen. Sorry, I don't remember your name. Amanda Cooper. My husband is a partner in one of the Blackwell family's investment companies. Amanda smiled genuinely. I wanted to tell you that I greatly admired how you carried yourself tonight. Thank you, said Helen, surprised by the unexpected compliment. Especially how you handled Constance during dinner. She can be challenging. I noticed that. Amanda hesitated for a moment before continuing. Helen, may I give you a tip? One woman to another? Please. Some people here tonight don't want you to do well. They'll try to find ways to make you stumble. Stay alert. I've already been warned about that, said Helen, but thank you for the alert. There's one more thing, said Amanda, looking around to make sure they weren't being overheard. I saw Edward talking with some photographers from the social press earlier. I thought you should know. Helen felt her stomach sink. What kind of conversation? I couldn't hear details, but it seemed like he was trying to arrange some kind of investigation. Before Helen could respond, Richard appeared beside them, his expression tense. Helen, I think we should leave, he said. So early? Asked Amanda, but her eyes showed understanding. It's been a long night, said Richard diplomatically. Helen looked between them, realizing that something had happened that she didn't know about. Of course, she said. Amanda, it was a pleasure to meet you. The pleasure was mine, said Amanda, shaking Helen's hand. I hope we see each other again soon. As they walked to the exit, Helen could feel the glances and hear the whispers that followed them. She knew that the night had been, in many respects, a success, but she also knew that she had awakened forces that would not be easily dissuaded. Richard, she said when they reached the car, what really happened in there? Richard looked at her for a long moment before answering. I think we just declared war on a world that isn't ready for changes. And are you sorry? No, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. For the first time in my life, I'm fighting for something that really matters. Helen smiled, but there was concern in her eyes. Then we better prepare for battle. The week following the charity dinner brought a series of consequences that neither Helen nor Richard had fully anticipated. On Monday morning, the first surprise came in the form of a call from Teresa to Helen. Dear, have you seen the social column in the paper today? Asked Teresa, her voice mixing concern and indignation. No, said Helen, immediately feeling a knot in her stomach. Why? Well, let's say someone leaked some information about you to the press. Nothing terrible, but biased. Helen found Richard in the kitchen, already with the newspaper open to the social section. His face was grim as he read. "What does it say?" asked Helen, preparing for the worst. Richard read aloud. Richard Blackwell caused a sensation at the family's annual charity dinner by appearing with a new companion, Helen Martinez, 30, who previously worked in the sales sector. Sources close reveal that Ms. Martinez recently experienced financial difficulties and was in a precarious housing situation before meeting Blackwell. The couple met in romantic, though unconventional circumstances. "That doesn't sound as bad as I expected," said Helen, trying to keep the tone light. "Keep reading," said Richard grimly. Although Ms. Martinez presented herself elegantly, at the event, some of the guests expressed surprise at Blackwell's unusual choice, especially considering his previous relationship with socialite Marianne Caldwell. An anonymous source commented, "It's admirable that Richard wants to help someone in need, but mixing charity with romance can be complicated for all involved." Helen sat heavily in a chair. "So now I'm officially a charity case that you're helping?" "Helen, you know it's not like that." "I know how you see me," interrupted Helen, "but now the whole world will interpret our relationship through that lens, the poor needy girl and the rich savior." Richard folded the newspaper with frustration. "Edward, I'm sure it was he who gave this information." "It doesn't matter who it was," said Helen, standing up and starting to pace around the kitchen. "The damage is done." "What damage? It's just a social column. People forget these things in a week." "Do they?" Helen stopped and stared at him. "Richard, you really don't understand, do you? This will follow me forever. Every time someone searches my name, this will be the first thing they find. The woman who seduced a rich man when she was desperate. But that's not what happened. You think that matters? The narrative is already established." Richard's phone rang. It was his mother. "Richard, we need to talk," said Isabella without preambles. "Now." "Mum, if it's about the column, it's about much more than the column. Come to the office and bring Helen." An hour later, they were sitting in the elegant law office that the Blackwell family had used for decades. Isabella was there, along with Robert and the family lawyer, Dr. Carter. "We received some interesting calls this morning," began Isabella without preambles. "Journalists asking questions, people offering information about Helen, and," she hesitated, "someone threatening to sell a sensationalist story to the tabloid press." "What kind of story?" asked Richard. Dr. Carter stepped forward. "Someone claims to have photographs of Helen in compromising situations from the last few months. They're asking for a substantial amount to not publish." Helen felt the world spin around her. "What kind of photographs?" "According to them, images of you sleeping in public places, looking for food in garbage cans, that sort of thing," said the lawyer gently. "Nothing illegal or immoral, but that would be humiliating if published," completed Helen, her voice almost a whisper. "This is blackmail," said Richard furiously. "We sue them." "Technically, they haven't made specific demands yet," explained Dr. Carter. "They only offered to give us the first chance to acquire the material." "How much do they want?" asked Helen. $50,000, Helen laughed, bitterly. $50,000 to protect the reputation of people I met a month ago. It's ironic. "Helen," said Robert gently, "we understand this is difficult for you, but we have resources to deal with this situation." "No," said Helen firmly, standing up. "Absolutely not." "Helen, be reasonable," said Isabella. $50,000 is a trivial amount to protect the family from an unnecessary scandal. To protect the family, or to protect you from being associated with me? "That's not fair," said Richard. "We're trying to help you." "Are you?" Helen turned to him. "Or are you trying to solve an embarrassing problem that I've become?" The silence that followed was tense and uncomfortable. "Helen," said Robert finally, "perhaps you need time to process this. Why don't you talk with Richard and give us an answer tomorrow?" "I don't need time," said Helen. "I won't let you pay." "This blackmail?" "Why not?" asked Isabella, genuinely curious. Because if you pay now, there will always be another person wanting money for information about me. Because I won't live the rest of my life as a skeleton in the family's closet. And because, Helen hesitated but then continued with determination, because these photographs show a part of my life that I'm not ashamed of. Helen, said Richard softly, you don't need to martyr yourself. It's not martyrdom, it's dignity, replied Helen. Richard, I slept on park benches because I had nowhere to go. I looked for food in the garbage because I was hungry. That's part of my story, and I won't pretend it didn't happen. But think of the embarrassment, began Isabella. For whom? Asked Helen. For me, or for you for being associated with me? This isn't about us, said Richard. Isn't it? Helen looked around the room. Then why are we all here discussing how to protect the family from a scandal? Dr. Carter cleared his throat. Helen, may I suggest an alternative approach? We can investigate who's behind this and potentially sue for harassment and attempted extortion. How long would that take? Months, possibly years. And during that time the threat remains, observed Helen. Yes. Helen sat down again, suddenly looking very tired. You know what the saddest part of all this is? No one answered. I was starting to believe that I had found a place where I could be myself, where my past didn't matter, only who I chose to be from now on. You can still have that, said Richard. Can I? Look at us, Richard. Sitting in a law office discussing public relations and crisis management. This isn't a relationship. It's an image rehabilitation project. Helen, it's not that, isn't it? She stood up again. Then tell me, Richard, if I were an ordinary woman with an ordinary past, would you have brought me to meet your family after 3 weeks? Would you be willing to face all this social pressure? Richard hesitated for just a second, but it was long enough for Helen to see the answer in his eyes. That's what I thought, she said softly. Helen, this isn't fair, protested Robert. Relationships always involve compromises and social adjustments. Compromises, yes, but this, Helen gestured to the whole situation. This is about hiding who I am to protect who you are. And if we say no to the blackmailers? Asked Isabella. If we let them publish whatever they want. Then I face the consequences, the same way I faced everything else in my life, with my head held high and alone. You won't be alone, said Richard firmly. Helen looked at him with a mixture of affection and sadness. Richard, you're a good man with noble intentions, but you can't protect me from the world, and I can't live in a golden bubble pretending that my past doesn't exist. So what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we need to admit that some differences are too big to be overcome, no matter how much goodwill exists on both sides. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that something fundamental had changed. The crisis had forced everyone to confront realities they had been trying to avoid. Helen, said Isabella finally, you are a remarkable young woman, but perhaps you're right about the incompatibilities of very different worlds. Mom, protested. Richard. Let her speak, said Helen calmly. If you decide to move forward with your life separately from Richard, I can guarantee that you will have our support to establish yourself professionally. No conditions, no expectations. Isabella, said Robert, surprised. It's the right thing to do, said Isabella simply. Helen looked at the matriarch with new respect. Thank you for the offer, but I think I need to do this alone. And about us? Asked Richard, his voice low. Helen approached him and touched his face gently. Richard, you gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Hope that I could be loved for who I really am. That's a gift I'll carry forever. This sounds like goodbye. It sounds like someone who learned that sometimes loving someone means letting them be free to find happiness where it really can exist. And with those words, Helen left the office, leaving behind not only Richard but the entire world she had briefly hoped to call her own. 3 months had passed since Helen left the law office, and with it, the life she had briefly shared with Richard. They were 3 months of careful reconstruction, of small victories and moments of profound loneliness. Helen had gotten the job at the cleaning company, and through her dedication and natural competence, was quickly promoted to team supervisor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and she had found real satisfaction in leading a group of working women who, like her, knew the value of every dollar earned. She had rented a small apartment in Greenwich Village, a simple but clean studio, with a window that looked out on a tree and enough space for her to breathe and dream. On the walls, she had placed some photos of her mother and some business administration books that she had started reading again, nurturing plans to resume her studies when her finances allowed. That Thursday afternoon, Helen was finishing her shift when she received an unexpected call. "Helen, this is Amanda Cooper. We met at the charity dinner." "Amanda, what a surprise! How did you get my number?" "Teresa Montgomery gave it to me. She said you wouldn't mind." "Helen, can I ask you a strange question?" "Of course. Are you still interested in completing your degree?" Helen hesitated. "Why?" "Well, my husband and I opened a community center in Brownsville. We're looking for someone to coordinate our professional training programs. The job includes a full scholarship to complete your degree, plus a decent salary." Helen sat down, heavily. "Amanda, that's very generous, but if this has anything to do with Richard—" "It doesn't," interrupted Amanda firmly. "Helen, at the dinner, I saw how you interacted with people. You have a natural ability to connect with others, to inspire trust. That's exactly what we need." I don't know what to say. Say that you'll at least come see the project tomorrow, no commitments." Meanwhile, across the city, Richard was going through his own moments of reconstruction. The 3 months without Helen had been a difficult journey of self-discovery. He had cut contact with many of his superficial friends, distanced himself from empty social obligations, and was trying to figure out who he really was when removed from all family expectations. Ironically, it was Edward who ended up being his most unlikely ally in this process. "You know I was wrong about her, don't you?" said Edward that afternoon, as they lunched at a simple restaurant, a dramatic change from the elegant places they used to frequent. "Were you?" "Completely. It took me a while to admit, but Helen never asked for anything from you. She never tried to take advantage of the situation. And when the pressure came, she left to protect you, not to protect herself." Richard played with the food on his plate. "I know that now. Maybe I always knew." "Then why didn't you go after her?" "Because she was right about everything." Richard sighed deeply. "Edward, in that office, when my parents were discussing how to protect the family from scandal, I realized that I was still seeing Helen as a problem to be solved, not as a person I loved." "And now?" "Now I understand that she deserves someone who loves her for what she is, not despite what she is, and I still don't know if I'm that person. Richard, can I tell you something that will sound strange coming from me?" "Sure." "These 3 months without her have changed you for the better. You're more real, more human. Maybe you're closer to being the person she deserves than you think." On the following Friday, Helen was visiting the community center that Amanda had mentioned. The project was impressive. A spacious and welcoming place where adults could learn new professional skills, children received school reinforcement, and families found support and resources. "It's amazing," said Helen to Amanda as they walked through the space. "You're really making a difference in people's lives." "We want to do even more," said Amanda. "That's why we need someone like you, someone who understands both the challenges and the possibilities." "Amanda, can I ask you a personal question?" Of course. Why is this important to you? Why not just donate money and let others manage it?" Amanda stopped and looked around the center. "Because I was also Helen, in a sense, not in the same way, but I grew up in a middle-class family that lost everything when my father was laid off during an economic crisis. I know what it's like to have to rebuild your life from scratch. I didn't know that. Few people do. I met my husband when I was a waitress working to pay for college. The difference is that I was lucky. I found someone who saw me for what I could become, not for what I had lost." Helen absorbed these words in silence. "Helen," continued Amanda, "will you accept the job?" "I will," said Helen, surprising herself with the quickness of her decision. "But with one condition." "What?" "If this is somehow a well-intentioned attempt to reconnect me with Richard, I need you to be honest about it." Amanda smiled. "Helen, I can assure you that Richard knows nothing about this offer, but," she hesitated. But I can tell you that he's not doing well. According to Teresa, he's been asking about you, discreetly but constantly. Amanda, I'm just being honest as you asked. What you do with that information is your choice. 2 months later, Helen was fully immersed in her new job. The community center had become more than a job, it was a passion. She had developed innovative programs, established partnerships with local businesses, and was seeing lives really change. On a Friday afternoon, she was reviewing proposals for new courses when Amanda knocked on the door of her small office. Helen, there's someone here who would like to talk to you about possible donations to the center. Of course, you can send them in. Amanda stepped aside, and through the door walked Richard. Helen felt her heart accelerate, but maintained professional composure. Richard, what a surprise. Helen. He stood in the doorway as if not sure if he was welcome. You look well. Radiant, actually. Thank you. Please, sit down. Richard sat in the chair in front of her desk, and Helen noticed that he too was different, more relaxed, less tense, wearing casual but elegant clothes. There was a peace in his eyes that she didn't remember having seen before. Amanda told me about the amazing work you're doing here, he said. It's a wonderful project, replied Helen, maintaining the professional tone. So you're interested in making a donation? I'm interested in many things, said Richard softly. The donation is just one of them. Richard, Helen, can I ask you a question? If you could go back to that night at the restaurant, would you change anything? Helen considered the question carefully. Honestly, yes and no. Explain. I would change how I handled the social pressure. I ran when I should have stayed and fought, but I wouldn't change the fact that I met you or the time we spent together. And I, said Richard, would change everything about how I reacted. When the pressure came, I should have defended you better, should have been clearer about my feelings, should have fought for us. Richard, we can't live in the past. No, but we can learn from it. He leaned forward. Helen, can I tell you what I've learned in these months? If you want. I learned that you were right. I was trying to fit you into my life instead of building a new life with us. I learned that my family and friends, though well-intentioned, don't define who I am or who I can become. And I learned that... He hesitated. What? That I love you, not as a project or a fantasy, but as the strong, independent, and inspiring woman you are. Helen felt tears forming in her eyes. Richard, before you say anything, he continued, quickly, I want you to know that I didn't come here to ask you to come back to my life. I came to ask if you would let me be part of yours. What do you mean? As a volunteer here at the center, as a student, learning about the work you do, as a man who wants to prove that he can be worthy of the woman you've become. Helen looked at him for a long moment. And your family? Your friends? All that world? They're still part of my life, but they no longer define it. Helen, if you give me a chance, a second chance, it will be as equals, as partners building something together, not as savior and saved. And if I say no, then I'll respect your decision and walk away. But first, I'll make the donation to the center, because I believe in the work you're doing here. Helen stood up and walked to the window, looking at the courtyard where children were playing, and adults were animatedly discussing their courses. Richard, she said finally without turning, you know this won't be easy. People will continue, talking, judging, questioning. I know. And you know that I won't go back to being that woman who stayed at your apartment depending on your generosity. I know. And that's not what I want. What do you want? I want to be a partner to an extraordinary woman who is changing the world, one person at a time. I want to learn from you, grow with you, build something meaningful by your side. Helen turned and looked at him. And if I say that maybe, just maybe, I want that too. The smile that lit up Richard's face was like the sunrise. Then I would say that we're the most unlikely pair that ever had the chance to discover that real love is about choosing someone every day, not just once. Helen walked back to him, stopping when she was very close. Richard, if we're going to try this again, it has to be completely different. I know. It has to be about real partnership, mutual respect, and building something together. I know. And if at any point you feel that I'm holding you back or that you're saving me, we stop. I completely agree. Helen extended her hand. Then, Mr. Blackwell, welcome to the Hope Community Center. When can you start as a volunteer? Richard shook her hand, but didn't let go. When the program coordinator agrees to have dinner with me, as equals, as partners, and as two people who are discovering that true love is about growing together. Helen smiled, the first truly free smile she had given since she had left him months ago. The coordinator is available tomorrow night, but she chooses the restaurant. She can choose any place, said Richard, gently kissing the hand he was still holding, as long as I can be there with her.